Hello, my name is Gorman, and this is my King Lear seminar. So, in this presentation, I'll be discussing how Shakespeare follows and or doesn't follow the tragic form through the competing storylines of Lear and his daughters, and Gloucester and his sons. Through the comparison of Lear and Gloucester, Shakespeare challenges the tragic form and the inevitability of the tragic hero's demise. While on the surface they both seem to end in tragic death, the juxtaposition of Lear and Gloucester highlights the differences in their tragic outcome, one heartbreakingly sad and one happy. So, this is the tragic form. It begins here with the noble birth, goes up to the tragic flaw, then the tragic hero makes the tragic error, and this is where his downfall begins. He goes from the top, which was his noble birth, to the bottom, which is the reversal of fortune, and then he realizes his mistake, but it's already too late. His death, or worse, is inevitable, and after he's gone, there's hope for a better future in the same world. Alright, so what I'm going to be doing is, for each part of the tragic form, I'm going to be analyzing it. I'm going to be showing where it's seen in Lear and where it's seen in Gloucester's storyline, and then I'm going to be comparing the two. The first part of the tragic form is the noble birth. So, King Lear, obviously, he is a king, and according to Aristotle, he says that a tragedy should elicit sympathy and fear. We sympathize with Lear because he's a good man who is retiring so his daughters can enjoy the benefits of his wealth before he dies. Gloucester, on the other hand, is a nobleman. He elicits sympathy because he's an old man who is kind and fair to everyone, but is tricked by his illegitimate son, Edmund. Comparison between the two, they're both of noble blood, and they both fit into Aristotle's requirements of a tragic hero. Second part of the tragic form is the tragic flaw. So, in King Lear, his tragic flaw is that he's gullible and he's rash. These flaws lead him to believe his two unloving daughters and banish his only true loving daughter. According to Calas, Cordelia is also partially at fault for Lear's demise, because she ought to have spoken out her love, if not for herself, at least for the sake of her love, of her father, who psychologically and physically weakened by oldness in this manner. She could have saved her from her father from the clutches of her evil sister, but her reserved and philosophical nature makes her to keep silent. This designates that she was ungrateful at that moment, and this led in further tragedy. Calas takes a different approach to this scenario by focusing more of the blame on Cordelia and less on Lear. According to Aristotle's definition of the tragic form, the hero's demise must be unavoidable, but this approach shows how Shakespeare could be challenging the tragic form, because he's saying that if Cordelia had just spoken out her true love, Lear's demise could have been avoided. Now I'm going to look at Gloucester. So, Gloucester is also gullible and overreacts to his shocking news of Edgar's apparent betrayal. He is rash, similar to Lear, and he says this quote, showing how right as Edmund shows Gloucester the letter, he overreacts immediately and puts all the blame on Edgar. This is all hearsay, or rather he writes, and he doesn't try to seek out the truth of the actual situation. The comparison between both of these is that both tragic heroes' flaw is that they are gullible and rash, which in both cases is what leads to their demise. Alright, now we're going to move on to their tragic error. So, King Lear's tragic error is what I said before, is that he chooses to believe his two unloving daughters and banish his only true loving daughter. Gloucester does a similar thing, and he believes Edmund, which is his unloving son, and turns on Edgar, when in reality Edmund just wants the inheritance, and Edgar really loves Gloucester. He makes Edmund his heir, and so gives him what he wanted, and the motive to further destroy Gloucester, to gain the inheritance earlier than expected. Comparison between these two is both heroes believe their false children and banish their true children, meaning they are manipulated by their own children. Fourth part of the tragic form is the reversal of fortune. This is seen in King Lear because Lear ends up naked, raving in a storm, and before he was a king who had all the riches, all the loyalty of everyone. Shakespeare could be making a comment here about only being able to see the truth once the clothes of power and flattery have been literally stripped away, because he's naked in the storm. Gloucester's reversal of fortune is that he has his eyes plucked out by Regan and Cornwall after being betrayed by Edmund regarding his communication with Cordelia in France on wanting to help Lear. Comparison, both Lear and Gloucester end up at the bottom of the Wheel of Fortune when they started at the top. Lear is wandering naked in a storm with no more power, and Gloucester has his eyes plucked out due to his tragic error. Fifth part is the tragic understanding. This is where they realize their flaw. So Lear, he realizes that he is a very foolish, fond old man who made the mistake of banishing his daughter who truly loved him. Interestingly, the fool character speaks the truth, and when Lear realizes the truth, he too is a fool. Finally, he calls Cordelia a fool after she has been hanged. So all the truth speakers are fools. It's a recurring theme in this story. Gloucester, he realizes he was tricked by Edmund, and Edgar was really loyal to him the whole time and was his true loving son. He says this quote, "Oh my follies, then Edgar was abused. Kind gods forgive me and prosper him." He also says, "Ah, dear son Edgar, the food of thy abused father's wrath, might I but live to see thee in my touch, I'd say I had eyes again." This last quote is ironic because he is saying this to Edgar, disguised as Tom of Bedlam, and of course, Gloucester does die immediately after Edgar reveals himself to him. Comparison between these two is both Lear and Gloucester realized they pushed away their loving children and believed their unloving children. The sixth part of the tragic form is death or worse. So, in the case of King Lear, Cordelia is hanged right in front of him and he holds her dead body in his arms. This image is heartbreaking because a father shouldn't ever have to witness his daughter die in front of him. Lear dies out of sadness after witnessing his daughter die, ultimately because of his actions. Gloucester, on the other hand, he dies because of his loyalty to Lear, combined with the fact that he realizes Edgar was with him the whole time, disguised as poor Tom. Gloucester dies out of happiness because Edgar was with him the entire time. This is where the major difference in tragic form of both characters comes in. Lear dies with sadness in his heart because Cordelia was his true, loving daughter that he pushed away ultimately led to her dying in front of him, whereas Gloucester dies with happiness in his heart because Edgar, his loving son, was with him the whole time and will live on to become the king. Shakespeare is challenging the tragic form because it is supposed to end in death or worse, but in the case of Gloucester, it actually ends in happiness. By making this change, I think Shakespeare is suggesting that the tragic form can still be clearly shown but have a different ending than usual. Moreover, the juxtaposition of Gloucester's happy ending to Lear's incredibly sad one elevates the tragedy of King Lear's storyline. In fact, in 1861, Nahum Tate rewrote Shakespeare's play and changed the ending so that instead of Cordelia and Lear dying, Edgar saves them at the last moment and they live on together happily ever after. Shakespeare's play already challenges the tragic form through Gloucester's happy ending, and now Nahum Tate has decided to make the ending into more of a comedy, and that it ends with the reunion of true love between Cordelia and Edgar, the good children. This shows how Shakespeare is not the only one to challenge the tragic form. Maybe as a society we oscillate between wanting comedies and tragedies depending on the general ethos of the era. Final part of the tragic form is the hope/catharsis, so this is like hope for the future. In the case of both Lear and Gloucester, they both end with Albany passing the crown on to Edgar, the most loyal son. He has experienced this madness and hardship, so like the fool and Lear, he can see the truth, and so his reign will most likely be good, and he will not make the same mistakes Lear did. Just like he manipulates the tragic form, the way Shakespeare wrote plays, including Lear, involved manipulating source material. His King Lear took a lot of inspiration from fairy tales, which Although we don't usually see them as tragedies, they often tell a similar story of daughters manipulating their fathers to gain power and authority. Fairy tales can be seen today as works of literature and modern media in the form of Disney movies. An article by Caitlin Mancino showcases how similar King Lear is to Disney fairy tales such as Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and Snow White. She says, through the weakness and ineptitude of fairy tale fathers, fairy tale daughters are able to gain power, authority, and autonomy. This same manipulation is shown in King Lear and Gloucester's tragic form. Because both heroes are manipulated by their children, Lear's kids become co-queens, and Gloucester's illegitimate son Edmund gains all of Edgar's future inheritance. Shakespeare's King Lear diverges from fairy tales because in fairy tales, the daughters, according to Mancino, are more using magic and marriage to manipulate their fathers, whereas in King Lear, the children use more lies and take advantage of their father's gullibility. This similarity to fairy tales shown through King Lear is trying to highlight how the story of King Lear is based on the same idea of father-child conflict, but Shakespeare has chosen to make this a tragedy where everyone dies in the end, whereas Walt Disney has chosen to make his fairy tales a happy ending. These changes in endings make us wonder, are tragedies or fairy tale romances a product of the times or a product of the intended audience, as Disney movies are wrote for children and Shakespeare's plays are wrote for more adults? My second comparison is to Akira Kurosawa's Ran. Akira Kurosawa's Ran, which was written in 1985, tells the story of an aging Sengoku-era warlord who decides to step down as ruler and divide his kingdom between his three sons. Taro, the eldest son, will receive the prestigious first castle and become leader of the Ichimonji clan, while Jiro and Saburo will receive the second and third castles and support their older brother. Hidetora also expects to retain the title of Great Lord. This is identical to Shakespeare's King Lear. Both tales of betrayal involve jaded rulers who relinquish their thrones and pass the torch down to their offspring, causing two of the children to turn against them, while the third supports them in their old age. Whereas Ran's Hidetora has three sons, King Lear has three daughters. Kurosawa's change from daughters to sons, he said, was a point of historical accuracy, because feudal Japan would not have had female inheritors. This leads to questions about why the story of Lear, which is based on English folklore and history, has daughters when women also had comparatively little status. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of female inheritance, or is it another example of pushing the boundaries of what is normal and expected? Also, in typical Shakespeare nature, both tales end with the death of the entire family. The similarities between Akira Kurosawa's Ran and Shakespeare's King Lear show how universal Shakespeare's themes are. They can also take place in Japan, and how much relevance they still have today, because father-child relationships will forever be a relevant issue. While Ran is set in the past, there are also adaptations of King Lear in novel form set in the present day around the globe, such as We That Are Young by Preti Teneja, set in India, and 1,000 Acres by Jane Smiley, which is set in rural Iowa. I've added these to my reading list, and I hope you do too. That's it for my presentation. Thank you very much.